The Pacific War was not born in a single moment of violence. It was the result of decades of ambition, fear, nationalism, and clashing visions for the future of Asia and the world. When America and Japan finally collided in open war, it unleashed one of the most devastating and transformative conflicts in human history. This was not just a war of battles and weapons, it was a war of ideologies, cultures, and survival, fought across vast oceans and remote islands, reshaping global power forever. At the dawn of the 20th century, Japan was a nation in rapid transformation. After centuries of isolation, the Meiji Restoration had propelled Japan into the modern world. Railroads stretched across the islands, factories roared to life, and a powerful military emerged, modeled after Western powers. Japan had learned a crucial lesson from history. In a world dominated by empires, strength was the only protection. Determined never to be colonized, Japan sought instead to become an empire itself. Across the Pacific, the United States was also rising. Having defeated Spain in 1898, America now possessed overseas territories such as the Philippines and Guam. Its navy grew larger, its economy stronger, and its influence reached deep into Asia through trade and diplomacy. While America publicly promoted ideas of open markets and self-determination, it too was driven by strategic interests, particularly in China and the Pacific Ocean. Japan's early victories fueled its ambitions. The defeat of China in the First Sino-Japanese War and Russia in the Russo-Japanese War shocked the world. For the first time, an Asian power had defeated a European empire. These victories convinced Japan's leaders that expansion was not only possible, but necessary. Resources were scarce on the Japanese islands, and industrial growth demanded oil, iron, rubber, and coal, materials found abundantly in Southeast Asia. The 1930s marked a turning point. Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, establishing a puppet state and drawing international condemnation. The League of Nations protested, but Japan simply withdrew from the organization. The message was clear: Japan would not be restrained by Western diplomacy. In 1937, Japan launched a full-scale invasion of China, igniting a brutal and prolonged war marked by atrocities, including the infamous Nanjing Massacre. The United States watched with growing alarm. While officially neutral, America was deeply concerned about Japanese expansion. China represented a vast market and a strategic partner. President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood that unchecked aggression in Asia threatened global stability. Yet America was cautious, still haunted by the losses of World War I and divided by isolationist sentiment at home. Economic pressure became America's weapon of choice. The U.S. imposed sanctions on Japan, restricting exports of key materials. The most devastating blow came in 1941, when America froze Japanese assets and cut off oil supplies. For Japan, this was an existential threat. Without oil, its navy would grind to a halt. Its empire would collapse. Japanese leaders now faced a stark choice: retreat from Asia or fight for survival. Within Japan's military leadership, war appeared inevitable. Negotiations with the United States dragged on, but neither side was willing to compromise on core demands. Japan insisted on dominance in East Asia. America demanded withdrawal from China. As talks stalled, a bold and dangerous plan took shape within Japan's naval command, a plan to strike first. On the morning of December 7, 1941, the world changed forever. Japanese aircraft filled the skies above Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, launching a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships burned, planes exploded on runways, and over 2,400 Americans were killed. Though Japan failed to destroy American aircraft carriers, the psychological impact was immense. The next day, President Roosevelt addressed Congress, calling December 7th a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war on Japan. Days later, Germany and Italy declared war on America, drawing the U.S. fully into World War II. What began as a regional conflict in Asia had now become a truly global war. Japan struck swiftly across the Pacific. Within months, Japanese forces captured Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and vast territories across Southeast Asia. European colonial powers collapsed with shocking speed. For a moment, it seemed as though Japan's vision of a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere might become reality. Japanese propaganda proclaimed liberation from Western imperialism, but the harsh reality of occupation soon shattered these promises. American forces reeled from early defeats. The fall of the Philippines in 1942 was a devastating blow. Thousands of American and Filipino soldiers endured the brutal Bataan Death March, symbolizing the cruelty of the conflict to come. Yet even in these dark days, the tide was quietly beginning to turn. The first sign of hope came with the Doolittle raid in April 1942. Though militarily insignificant, American bombers struck Tokyo itself, shocking Japan and boosting American morale. More importantly, it forced Japan to reconsider its defensive strategy, setting the stage for a decisive confrontation. That confrontation arrived in June 1942 at the Battle of Midway. Through intelligence breakthroughs, the United States anticipated Japan's attack and prepared an ambush. In a single day, 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were sunk, along with hundreds of experienced pilots. The balance of power in the Pacific shifted dramatically. Japan would never recover from this loss. From this moment onward, the Pacific War became a brutal contest of endurance. America adopted a strategy known as island hopping, bypassing heavily fortified positions and capturing key islands to move closer to Japan itself. Each battle was savage. Jungle warfare, relentless bombardment, and close-quarters combat turned islands like Guadalcanal into nightmares of blood and exhaustion. The fighting was unlike anything seen in Europe. The vast distances of the Pacific, the ferocity of Japanese resistance, and the refusal to surrender turned each encounter into a fight to the death. Japanese soldiers, guided by a code of honor that rejected surrender, fought until annihilation. American troops, facing ambushes and suicide charges, learned that this enemy would not retreat easily. As the war dragged on, both nations mobilized their entire societies. American factories produced ships, planes, and weapons at an unprecedented scale. Women entered the workforce in massive numbers. Japan, under constant bombardment and resource shortages, demanded total sacrifice from its people. Cities were fortified, civilians trained, and children taught to prepare for invasion. By 1944, American forces were advancing steadily. The capture of Saipan brought U.S. bombers within range of the Japanese mainland. For Japan, the war had now come home. Desperation led to the rise of kamikaze attacks, suicide pilots who crashed their planes into American ships. These attacks inflicted heavy damage but could not stop the overwhelming industrial and military power of the United States. The Battle of Leyte Gulf marked the largest naval battle in history and effectively destroyed Japan's remaining fleet. From this point forward, Japan was fighting a losing battle, yet surrender remained unthinkable to its leaders. The war entered its most horrific phase. By late 1942, the Pacific War had entered a new and terrifying phase. The early momentum Japan once enjoyed was gone, replaced by a relentless American counteroffensive that would grind forward mile by mile, island by island. This was not a war of sweeping fronts or quick victories. It was a slow, brutal advance across some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. Jungles thick with disease, coral reefs stained with blood, and volcanic islands that became mass graves for tens of thousands of soldiers. The strategy that guided America's advance was known as island hopping.
Rather than assault every Japanese stronghold, U.S. planners identified strategically vital islands that could support airfields and naval bases. Heavily fortified but strategically isolated islands were left to wither without supplies. This approach conserved lives and accelerated the march toward Japan itself, but it did not make the battles that were fought any less horrific. Guadalcanal became the first true test of this strategy. For months, American and Japanese forces fought in brutal conditions, battling not only each other, but disease, hunger, and exhaustion. Nighttime naval battles lit the seas with fire, while soldiers clashed in dense jungle where visibility was measured in feet. Victory at Guadalcanal marked the first major Allied land success against Japan and shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility. As American forces pushed forward, they encountered an enemy that fought with extraordinary tenacity.
Japanese defenses were no longer focused on beaches, but deeply entrenched inland. Soldiers dug elaborate tunnel systems, turning entire islands into underground fortresses. Every ridge, cave, and hill became a potential killing ground. The goal was no longer victory, but to inflict such staggering losses that the enemy might abandon the war. The Battle of Tarawa in 1943 shocked American commanders. Despite overwhelming firepower, the assault cost thousands of lives in just a few days. Marines were cut down, crossing reefs under machine gun fire, their bodies piled on beaches that would soon become symbols of sacrifice. Yet even these losses did not halt the advance. Instead, they hardened American resolve and reshaped amphibious tactics for future invasions. The capture of the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam was a turning point of enormous significance. These islands placed American bombers within striking distance of the Japanese mainland. For the first time, civilians in Japan could hear the distant roar of enemy aircraft overhead. The psychological impact was immense. The war was no longer a distant struggle fought overseas, it was coming home. Saipan also revealed the tragic cost of Japanese wartime ideology. As American forces closed in, thousands of civilians, terrified by propaganda that portrayed Americans as monsters, chose suicide over capture. Families leapt from cliffs, parents killing their own children before themselves. These scenes horrified American troops and revealed how deeply the war had consumed the minds of the Japanese people. By 1944, Japan's situation was desperate. Its navy was shattered, its air force depleted, and its industry crippled by shortages. Yet surrender was still unthinkable. Instead, Japan turned to a new and terrifying tactic: kamikaze warfare. Young pilots, often barely trained, were instructed to crash explosive-laden aircraft directly into American ships. To die for the emperor was portrayed as the highest honor. The first large-scale kamikaze attacks occurred during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in human history. Japanese planes plunged into U.S. carriers and destroyers, causing massive explosions and horrific casualties. Sailors described the helplessness of watching a plane dive straight toward them, knowing there was little they could do to stop it. Though kamikaze attacks sank and damaged many ships, they could not reverse Japan's fate. Leyte Gulf effectively destroyed what remained of Japan's naval power. From that moment forward, Japan was strategically defeated, though the war was far from over. The American advance now focused on the final stepping stones toward the Japanese homeland, two islands whose names would become synonymous with unimaginable bloodshed: Iwo Jima and Okinawa. Iwo Jima was a small volcanic island, but its significance was enormous. It provided airfields that could protect American bombers and serve as emergency landing sites. Japanese defenders transformed the island into a fortress beneath the earth, carving tunnels through solid rock. When American Marines landed in February 1945, they faced a nightmare. The battle for Iwo Jima lasted over a month, Every inch of ground was contested. Japanese soldiers emerged from hidden tunnels to attack, then vanished again. Flamethrowers, grenades, and hand-to-hand combat became the tools of survival. When the iconic American flag was raised atop Mount Suribachi, the battle was far from over. By the time Iwo Jima was secured, nearly all of its Japanese defenders were dead, along with thousands of Americans. Okinawa would be even worse. As the final barrier before Japan itself, Okinawa was defended with fanatical determination. The invasion in April 1945 unleashed one of the bloodiest battles of the entire war. Kamikaze attacks reached unprecedented levels, waves of suicide pilots slamming into the U.S. fleet. Ships burned, sank, and drifted as floating wrecks filled with the wounded and dead. On land, the fighting was relentless. Torrential rains turned the battlefield into mud and chaos. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, many forced by Japanese soldiers to commit suicide or serve as human shields. The scale of suffering was immense. By the end of the battle, tens of thousands of civilians were dead, along with over 12,000 Americans and more than 100,000 Japanese soldiers. Okinawa shocked American leaders. If the invasion of a single island could cost so many lives, what would an invasion of Japan itself demand? Military planners estimated that Operation Downfall, the invasion of the Japanese mainland, could result in millions of casualties, both military and civilian. Japan was preparing its population for a final, apocalyptic defense. Bamboo spears were issued to civilians. School children were trained to fight. The nation was being prepared for annihilation. Meanwhile, American bombers unleashed devastation from the skies. Massive firebombing raids turned Japanese cities into seas of flame. Tokyo burned in March 1945, killing more civilians in a single night than either atomic bombing would later cause. Wooden homes ignited instantly, trapping families in infernos that consumed entire neighborhoods. Despite this destruction, Japan's leaders remained divided. Some sought peace, others demanded continued resistance. The emperor himself remained silent, bound by tradition and the weight of history. The war had reached a deadlock of willpower, one side unwilling to surrender, the other unwilling to sacrifice millions more lives. In the deserts of New Mexico, a new and terrifying weapon was nearing completion. Born from scientific genius and wartime urgency, it promised to end the war in a single catastrophic blow. Few could fully comprehend its power, but its consequences would reshape the world forever. The Pacific War was approaching its final act.